The conference room was silent except for the soft hum of the projector. I had spent months preparing for this moment, studying every clause, forecasting every risk, and understanding the psychology of the client's board. Our company was on the brink of securing a contract so valuable that analysts were already whispering about expansion plans and stock valuation spikes. The client's CEO leaned forward as I walked them through the final phase of our proposal. Every nod they gave confirmed what I already knew. The deal was ours to lose. In the middle of a crucial clause discussion, the door burst open. My boss marched in like a man who mistook authority for intelligence. His jaw was clenched, his pride inflated beyond repair. Without greeting anyone, he slammed a folder on the table. The client's executives exchanged uneasy glances. I remained composed, assuming he was there to reinforce my points. Instead, he pointed directly at me. "This negotiation doesn't need you anymore," he declared. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The client's CEO frowned, confused. My team froze. Then, as if humiliating an employee mid-deal was routine, he announced that I was fired. He didn't offer an explanation, not even a pretext. He simply decided that the person who built the negotiation from the ground up had no place in its conclusion. Security arrived moments later, instructed to remove me. They took my badge, shut down my laptop remotely, and escorted me past colleagues who stood like statues. My boss followed behind, smirking, convinced he had reasserted dominance. He believed leadership was measured in public takedowns, not competence. By the time I reached the lobby, my access had already been revoked. It felt like a surgical extraction, quick, silent, and intended to wound. What he failed to understand was painfully simple. The client didn't care about titles or office politics. They trusted the person who answered their messages at midnight, recalculated figures without complaint, and treated their vision as more than numbers on a spreadsheet. He hadn't fired an employee. He had severed the only viable path to the contract. A bridge can be ignored, underestimated, even insulted. But once burned, it forces travelers to find another route. And some routes lead somewhere far more rewarding than the place they were pushed out of. The morning after my dismissal, I expected silence.
Shame.
Maybe even regret. Instead, my phone vibrated before sunrise. The name on the screen was the client CEO. At first, I assumed it was a courtesy message, an attempt to smooth over the awkwardness of yesterday's spectacle. I let it ring twice before answering, unsure what tone to expect. To my surprise, the voice on the other end was calm, not confused, not apologetic, simply decisive. He didn't mention my firing. He didn't ask whether I was all right. Instead, he went straight to the point. He wanted context on the negotiation, clarification on a clause he claimed my former boss didn't fully grasp, and insight into future integrations. It was a conversation rooted in respect, not hierarchy. When I explained that I no longer represented the company, he didn't hesitate. "That's not what I asked," he said. "Are you available to continue this somewhere else?" For a moment, the world shifted. No vindication, no fanfare, just a simple acknowledgement that competence travels farther than authority. That sentence wasn't sympathy. It was strategy. A declaration that the negotiation wasn't tied to brick walls, logos, or company structure. It was tied to the person who built it. I didn't accept immediately. Not because I doubted him, but because I understood the magnitude of his request. If I agreed, this wasn't just business. It was war, a quiet, calculated war where reputations, contracts, and futures were the battlefield. Before giving him an answer, I needed clarity. Why reach out to me? Why risk angering a company prepared to weaponize legal departments at the slightest threat? His response was simple. "Your boss is a man who believes deals are bought. You're someone who builds them. We prefer builders." That sentence revealed everything. While my former employer paraded authority like a medal, the client had been observing something else entirely, the craftsmanship behind the relationship. They had noticed who followed up on details, who remembered personal concerns, who adapted presentations based on unspoken hesitation, who transformed complexity into confidence. Titles don't do that. Work does. After the call, I sat in my living room, surrounded by the remnants of a life abruptly interrupted. A few boxes with personal items from my office, a deactivated badge, and a severed corporate email account. The humiliation of being escorted out still lingered, yet in that quiet space, the humiliation felt less like an ending and more like a door that someone else had conveniently slammed shut for me. By midday, the client sent me a draft proposal for collaboration. Not as an employee, as an independent consultant. They were prepared to pay triple my original salary and grant partial commission on the contract's execution. It was more than money. It was validation. Proof that value isn't erased by dismissal and respect isn't revoked with a badge. Meanwhile, word spread through my former company like a contagion. Employees whispered about the firing, some in disbelief, others in quiet satisfaction. Many had witnessed the negotiation evolve over months. They knew who pushed it forward and who merely appeared when the cameras were on. My boss, however, interpreted the shock as fear-driven admiration. He strutted through the hallways, convinced he had demonstrated decisive leadership. It didn't take long for reality to arrive. The client insisted on pausing the negotiation until I was reinstated or replaced with someone possessing my level of knowledge. My ex-boss panicked. He tried calling me, emailing me, even messaging mutual acquaintances, pretending my departure had been part of a restructuring strategy. The client refused to comply. They didn't want a surrogate. They wanted the original architect. That's when the first cracks appeared in his confidence. He had assumed the deal was secured by pedigree and presence. He failed to realize it was secured by preparation, patience, and personal investment. A man who mistakes authority for intellect always discovers the truth too late. The deal wasn't a trophy. It was a relationship, and relationships don't obey titles. When I finally accepted the client's offer, it wasn't revenge. It was alignment. My skills had found a new home, one where merit wasn't questioned or discarded mid-sentence. My former employer hadn't fired a negotiator. He had released an asset. He just didn't know it yet. Some wars are fought with weapons. This one would be fought with signatures, contracts, and silence. And I was ready. The irony of my dismissal didn't fully surface until I finally sat down and reread my employment contract. It was a habit I developed early in my career. Never sign anything you don't understand. My former boss, however, believed contracts were formalities, ceremonial papers that existed to decorate file cabinets. That arrogance would become his undoing. Buried in the dense legal language was a clause I remembered negotiating years ago. At the time, it felt like a precaution, something that protected my intellectual contributions should the company ever shift direction. Now, it read like destiny. The clause stated that all methodologies, frameworks, and negotiation systems developed independently by me remained my property unless formally transferred in writing. No transfer had ever occurred. I own the architecture behind the entire deal. The proposal structure, the analytical model that forecasted market growth, the phased integration roadmap, every component that impressed the client had originated from my private notes, research, and strategies. The company had provided resources, but I had provided direction. When I left, the knowledge left with me. My former boss assumed authority equaled ownership. He believed removing the person meant absorbing their work. He never realized that competence doesn't evaporate when a badge is deactivated. Within days, his oversight turned into a crisis. The negotiation team stumbled over technical terminology they had never fully grasped. They tried to replicate my approach using outdated templates, unaware that the client expected a dynamic system tailored specifically to their future operations. The more they spoke, the more they revealed how little they understood. The client noticed the difference instantly. Phones started ringing. My old colleagues reached out in disbelief, asking if I had seriously retained rights to the intellectual property. I didn't brag. I didn't gloat. I simply reminded them of the contract's language. My boss, who prided himself on control, had never bothered reading the document that governed his own leverage. He owned a company stocked with desks, screens, and a logo. I owned the blueprint that justified its relevance. Without it, he was just another executive with a building full of confused employees. Power doesn't belong to the person who approves expenses. It belongs to the person who creates value. and value was never his to claim. The lunch invitation arrived with the kind of precision that suggested intention, not coincidence. No corporate logos, no formal signatures, just a handwritten note and a reservation time at a venue known only to people who understood that real deals were never made in boardrooms. The restaurant was quiet, positioned behind tinted windows and ivy-covered walls, where conversations disappeared into linen napkins and privacy was the default currency. When I walked in, the client's senior executive was already seated. No entourage, no pomp, just a man who looked like he had already made up his mind. He didn't begin with pleasantries. He didn't ask how I was handling being publicly fired. Instead, he asked about the negotiation, the real one, the one built on trust, foresight, and mutual interest rather than ego. I answered calmly, knowing every word was being evaluated. He nodded, not in approval, but in confirmation, as though the conversation merely validated what he already believed. Only after the first course arrived did he acknowledge the elephant my boss had dragged into the room the day before. He didn't criticize him or mock the spectacle. Instead, he complimented something else entirely, my silence. While my boss had exploded like a man desperate for validation, I had remained composed. To him, that composure wasn't submission. It was strategy. He explained that tantrums reveal insecurity, while silence reveals discipline. In their world, discipline was the closest thing to power. Then he leaned forward and offered the line that shifted everything. "We don't follow companies," he said. "We follow people who deliver." The words were simple, but the implication was seismic. He wasn't interested in brands, titles, or corner offices. He wanted the architect, not the building. The lunch wasn't damage control. It was recruitment. He slid a discreet folder across the table. Inside was more than an offer, it was a roadmap. A leadership position within their global expansion project. Autonomy over negotiations. A team built around my methodology. And the part that made my pulse slow rather than quicken. The deal would proceed under my name, not my former employer's. It wasn't flattery. It was leverage. They recognized something my boss never understood. Relationships are currency, and I was the mint. They weren't just buying expertise. They were purchasing trajectory, the ability to scale a negotiation into something with long-term structural value. To them, I wasn't a negotiator. I was infrastructure. Still, I didn't accept. Not yet. Accepting immediately would have been emotional. My decision needed to be architectural. Revenge, while tempting, is fleeting unless anchored to something larger than satisfaction. I wanted alignment, protection, and longevity, not just victory. A hastily accepted offer would make me look like someone escaping humiliation. I wanted to enter on my terms, not react to theirs. So I asked questions. Lots of them. About decision-making authority, intellectual property terms, exit clauses, performance structures, and future autonomy. They answered without hesitation. They weren't courting an employee. They were courting an asset. Then came the part they didn't say aloud, but wanted me to understand. By transferring the negotiation to me, the client wasn't abandoning my former company. They were exposing it. My boss had fired the only person capable of delivering what he had promised. Once I accepted, his board would discover the scale of his error. Contracts aren't lost in meetings. They wither when competence leaves the room. I closed the folder and didn't commit. Not because I doubted them, but because timing is the spine of every decisive move. If I agreed too quickly, the satisfaction would evaporate. If I waited strategically, the consequences would mature into something irreversible. As we finished dessert, the executive didn't press. He smiled as if he already knew the answer. Some offers don't require verbal acceptance. They just need space to breathe. When I left the restaurant, the city felt different. I wasn't unemployed. I was unclaimed. I wasn't wandering. I was choosing. And choices, when built correctly, have a way of turning mistakes into monuments. Revenge isn't loud. It doesn't roar, shout, or slam doors. It waits. And I had just been handed the perfect stage to let it grow. The fallout didn't arrive with thunder. It crept in quietly, like an unexpected winter draft slipping through the cracks. 1 week after my exit, the office no longer buzzed with excitement over the contract. Instead, whispers replaced confidence. Employees who once strutted past each other now exchanged nervous glances in the corridors. Something was wrong, and everyone could feel it. The client had paused all negotiations. Not delayed, not rescheduled, paused. No one inside the company dared to admit why, but the truth spread faster than any memo. Without my systems, projections, and strategic roadmap, the team was staring at documents they didn't understand. Every attempt to advance the deal exposed gaps in knowledge my boss never bothered to fill. He had treated expertise like furniture, easy to replace, always available. He was now discovering that strategy has fingerprints and mine were on everything. Panic forced him into action. He summoned department heads at dawn, demanded revisions to presentations he didn't comprehend, and rewrote sections of proposals as if rearranging sentences could replace substance. Someone described those meetings as performances of authority. The script was loud. The content was hollow. Eventually, he reached out to me. Not with humility, not with acknowledgement, but with entitlement. He requested copies of my negotiation frameworks, believing they were part of his inheritance as CEO. To him, ownership was automatic. Anything created under his roof belonged to him. My answer was simple. 2 words that punctured his illusion like a pin to a balloon. They're mine. It wasn't anger. It was fact. My contract protected every tool he assumed he controlled. Once he read the clause, really read it, silence swallowed the company. Meetings halted. Investors grew restless. Projected triumph turned into impending embarrassment. That silence did more damage than any public scandal. It revealed the truth no one dared to speak. He hadn't fired an employee. He had discarded the only person capable of executing the vision he claimed as his own. The board began asking questions he couldn't answer. The future he boasted about suddenly looked like a promise written on quicksand. Some mistakes bruise an ego. This one bankrupted a legacy. The news broke before sunrise, first as a whisper on industry forums, then as a headline no one at my former company wanted to read. I had officially joined the client, not as an employee, but as a strategic partner with full authority over the very negotiation my old boss believed he controlled. Overnight, the entire narrative shifted. What had once been a contract became a migration. The client wasn't shopping for services anymore. They were restructuring their future, and I was the architect. Their board moved with unnerving speed. Within hours, my proposal was approved without hesitation. They understood every element because they had seen it evolve in real time through my work. Departments began aligning with the roadmap I designed, integrating methodologies my former company had barely begun to comprehend. The systems that once lived in my laptop now became the blueprint for a multinational expansion. It was the kind of rollout executives bragged about, except this one was happening somewhere else. The most jarring blow came next. The client issued a formal notice terminating all pending negotiations with my old employer. But they didn't stop there. They transferred the entire account under my leadership. Not a portion, not a trial phase. The whole account. Years of projections, marketing budgets, and expansion plans evaporated from my former boss's control like smoke in a draft. Inside the company, chaos wasn't loud. It was suffocating. Executives who had once applauded my removal now scrambled to explain how a celebrated opportunity had turned into a public humiliation. Investors demanded answers. Employees updated resumes. And my boss, the man who treated me like an accessory, was forced to confront something he refused to believe. Loyalty doesn't belong to titles. It belongs to those who deliver results. The client's decision wasn't emotional. It was strategic. They didn't leave because they disliked him. They left because he had nothing to offer once the person who built the bridge was gone. In business, loyalty is not a reward for hierarchy. It is a payment for value. And he couldn't afford my value. What he assumed was a dismissal turned out to be a promotion, just not his. The company had always strutted like a giant, but in reality, it stood on borrowed confidence. Its reputation was credit, not capital, and the client I took with me had been its only collateral. The moment their departure became public, everything that once looked stable began to tremble. Forecasts that were proudly presented in board meetings now read like fiction. Revenue graphs dipped, pipelines emptied, and the illusion of growth dissolved under scrutiny. Shareholders, once dazzled by presentation slides and ambitious rhetoric, demanded answers. Their emails multiplied by the hour. They wanted explanations, timelines, guarantees, anything that resembled a plan. What they received instead were clichés, excuses, and a leader sweating through rehearsed statements. The company's confidence evaporated the moment someone asked for numbers instead of adjectives. The departments that once operated with swagger suddenly froze. Budgets were locked. Hiring was halted. Travel approvals vanished. Teams who had been promised promotions and bonuses found themselves questioning whether the company would even survive the year. The cafeteria gossip shifted from weekend plans to job market strategies. Hope became rumor. Rumor became certainty. My former boss scrambled for scapegoats. He cited inflation, market instability, emerging competitors, even seasonal shifts in customer behavior. He spoke as though the universe had conspired against him. Yet everyone inside the company knew the truth he refused to acknowledge. He had fired the only person holding the keys to the contract that sustained their future. His arrogance had not been leadership. It had been a liability disguised as authority. The board grew impatient. Investors tightened their grip. Analysts who once praised the company's trajectory began publishing cautious evaluations. Some questioned whether leadership was competent enough to navigate uncertainty. Others hinted at mismanagement. The whispers that once trailed behind him turned into conversations held in conference rooms he was no longer invited to. Kingdoms don't collapse when enemies attack. They collapse when foundations crack. His foundation had been me. The strategy, the vision, the execution he never understood but believed he owned. When he severed that link, he didn't lose an employee. He pulled the first brick from his own structure. Arrogance is not a trait in corporate leadership. It is a timer. His reached zero much faster than he ever planned for. Revenge is often portrayed as rage, a dramatic burst of spite hurled at the world in a moment of emotional weakness. People imagine it as shouting, breaking, exposing, or humiliating someone in a public spectacle. But anyone with age, experience, and scars knows the truth. Real revenge does not shout. It calculates. It observes. It waits. The most devastating consequences in business are not born from anger. They are born from logistics, timing, and the quiet understanding of where true power resides. My former boss believed he controlled power. He measured it in parking spaces, office size, and whether people stood when he entered a room. He assumed that authority was a birthright attached to his title, as though success flowed through genealogical veins. When he fired me mid-negotiation, he thought he was making a statement. In his mind, he was removing a pawn to show the board who the king was. What he never realized was that in business, pawns become queens the moment they reach the other side. His action didn't demonstrate dominance. It revealed ignorance. He believed the negotiation revolved around him because the company's name sat at the top of the contract. He had no idea the deal was never about the name on the building. It was about the relationship I had forged over months of understanding, adapting, anticipating, and aligning. He mistook presence for influence, forgetting that influence is invisible and irreplaceable once earned. When he removed me, he didn't sever a role. He severed the trust that made the negotiation possible. By the time he realized what that meant, the damage was irreversible. The client didn't hesitate, didn't panic, didn't question their direction. They followed the person who understood their language, their concerns, their ambition. They followed me, because power doesn't cling to titles. It moves with competence. And so the lesson began. As the negotiations collapsed without me, he doubled down on posturing. He tried to mimic confidence, the way a child imitates an adult's walk without understanding the weight carried in each step. He replaced humility with volume, vision with slogans, leadership with theatrics. The more he tried to salvage the situation, the more obvious it became. He had never been the architect of the deal. He had only been the man holding the pen. I did not respond with threats, statements, or explanations. My silence was not retreat. It was strategy. Silence forces clarity. It exposes who is prepared and who is pretending. While he scrambled to prove he was irreplaceable, the client measured value differently. They didn't care who sat in which office. They cared who could deliver results. And the moment they made their choice, the hierarchy he worshipped became meaningless. People say I stole his client. That isn't accurate. You cannot steal what was never his. He never earned them. He inherited their presence like someone who stumbles upon treasure and assumes owning the box means owning the gold. The client wasn't loyal to the company. They were loyal to the mind, discipline, and strategy that carried them toward their goals. When I walked out, so did the value. What he perceived as betrayal was actually gravity. Trust gravitates toward competence. Remove competence, and everything else falls. The consequences were not dramatic at first. They were subtle. Budgets froze. Expectations shifted. Board members asked carefully phrased questions that sounded polite but carried blades. Investors scrutinized projections. Rumors turned into reports. At every turn, the same truth echoed louder. He didn't lose a negotiation. He lost the reason negotiations happened. That is the price of arrogance, not immediate failure, but inevitable collapse. Ego blinds leaders into believing their position protects them. But positions are temporary. Relevance is earned. Without relevance, authority is nothing more than a costume worn by someone hoping the audience doesn't notice the fabric tearing apart. While his world shrank, mine expanded. Not because I sought revenge, but because I understood systems. I built relationships carefully, one conversation at a time, like bricks laid on a foundation of expertise. I learned early that in business, the people who do the work quietly shape the future long before those who talk about the work understand what is happening. Joining the client was not an act of retaliation. It was an act of progression. They didn't choose me to hurt him. They chose me because I represented movement, growth, structure. They wanted leadership grounded in skill, not ego. They were investing in continuity, not theatrics. My silence became my signature. Where he spoke loudly, I executed precisely. While he clung to the idea of control, I demonstrated control without needing to declare it. The industry took note. Colleagues began reassessing what leadership meant. Clients started questioning whether titles reflected capability. Recruiters whispered that the era of hollow authority was ending. And somewhere behind the humiliation and blame, my former boss finally confronted a truth he had ignored his entire career. You don't win business by removing people. You win business by empowering the right ones. His downfall was not my victory. My victory was the career I built, brick by brick, contract by contract, without raising my voice or waving my resume like a flag. His story ended where mine began, not because I fought him, but because I learned what he never could. Power is not inherited. It is earned, protected, and reinforced by those who trust you enough to walk behind you. He fired me to prove he was in control. I proved control doesn't live in titles. It lives in the decisions others make when you leave the room. His ego cost him a contract. My silence built me a legacy. And every leader who watched this unfold was left with a lesson they will never forget. In business, the smartest move is never removing the person who carries the blueprint. It is understanding that without the architect, even the largest kingdom becomes a ruin in waiting.